Okay, so today we're going to do a deep dive into a book that's been making a lot of noise and getting people talking about our modern habits and desires. It's called Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. I'm sure you've at least seen the title around.
Oh, yeah,
And maybe you've even wondered what all the hype is about.
definitely. It's really gotten a lot of attention.
Yeah, so I'm excited to dig into it today with you and see what we can unpack.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating look at, why we do the things we do, especially in a world where instant gratification is so readily available everywhere we look.
Yeah, and it gets into some pretty deep stuff about, the fundamental mechanisms of pleasure and pain, right, in our brains.
Exactly.
So it's not just kind of like a self-help book. It's
Right.
really getting into like the nitty-gritty.
It's going deep.
Yeah, and the author, Dr. Lembke, she's a psychiatrist, so she's coming at this from, a very informed scientific perspective.
Right.
But what makes it so compelling is that she combines that hard science with really relatable and often very moving stories from her patients.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it so powerful.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about the science.
Yeah.
It's about the human experience.
Right, exactly. So for our deep dive today, what we really want to do is pull out those core arguments and key insights that Dr. Lembke presents in Dopamine Nation.
Okay.
So we want to give you a solid understanding of her main ideas and also touch upon some of the different perspectives that have come up around the book, how readers have been experiencing it and responding to it.
That was good.
All right, so Dopamine Nation draws on a really interesting mix of sources. There's rigorous scientific studies in there about how our brain chemicals work,
Right.
but it also incorporates those very personal and sometimes pretty raw accounts from people who are navigating addiction and different kinds of compulsive behaviors.
Right, and that combination is really what makes it so engaging.
Yeah. So let's dive right in. The central concept that the book explores is this idea of the pleasure-pain balance. So what exactly is that in a nutshell?
So the basic idea is that pleasure and pain are actually processed in the same areas of our brain. And Dr. Lembke uses this great visual of a balance scale to illustrate it.
Okay.
So when we experience something pleasurable, it tips the scale to one side, and then our brain is constantly working to bring it back to equilibrium.
Interesting. So it's like our brain is always trying to level out.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So then dopamine plays a big role here, right? That's the neurotransmitter we always hear about when it comes to pleasure and reward.
Definitely dopamine is like the key player in our brain's reward system.
Okay.
And it's interesting. Scientists can actually measure the amount of dopamine that's released in response to different stimuli
Oh, wow.
to kind of gauge their addictive potential.
Really?
Yeah, so like for example, they found that eating chocolate might increase your dopamine by about 55%.
Okay.
But then something like sex, that might be closer to like 100% increase.
Oh, wow. So there's like a scale.
Right, there's a range, and then like nicotine that's up around 150%.
Okay.
Cocaine jumps to about 225%.
And these are all like scientifically measured.
Yeah, these are based on studies.
Wow. That's fascinating. And then what about something like amphetamine, like what you find in speed?
Oh yeah, that can cause a huge dopamine surge.
Yeah.
Like up to 1,000%.
Wow, 1,000%.
Yeah, it's a massive difference.
Okay, so that really puts things in perspective.
Right, it kind of shows you the spectrum of how these things can affect our brains.
That's right. So when we're living in an environment where we're constantly bombarded by these high dopamine triggers, not just drugs, but things like super tasty food, the constant stimulation from news and social media,
Right.
what's that doing to this delicate balance in our brains, just in our everyday lives?
So the book argues that all this exposure to high dopamine experiences, it kind of throws the balance off.
Yeah.
It tips it really heavily towards pleasure at first,
Okay.
but then your brain, it's incredibly adaptive,
Right.
and it wants to get back to that baseline. So to counteract all that extra pleasure, it actually starts to become less sensitive to dopamine
Oh, wow.
and more sensitive to pain. It's like it's adding weights to the other side of the scale to try to even things out.
So it's like a seesaw almost.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like pushing down harder on the pain side to try to counteract all the pleasure that we're getting.
Right, so you get that initial hit of pleasure, but then you need more and more to get the same feeling.
Right. Which I guess is how tolerance develops.
Exactly. And eventually you might even start feeling kind of bad or restless when you're not engaging in that specific thing.
Right. So that's where the craving comes in.
Exactly. Dr. Lembke explains craving as that feeling when your brain's pleasure-pain balance has tipped over to the pain side.
Okay.
It's that intense desire, like for another slice of cake, or you keep scrolling on your phone even when you know you should stop.
Right.
It's your brain basically saying, hey, we're out of whack here. We need to get back to that comfortable state.
So it's this constant cycle of chasing that initial high, but our brains are working against us in the long run.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky situation.
So this brings us to tolerance and neuroadaptation. What exactly do these terms mean in this context?
So tolerance is basically when you need more of a substance or behavior to get the same level of pleasure that you used to get.
Okay.
Like, remember when you were talking about rereading the Twilight Saga?
Oh, yeah.
Like, the first time you read it, it was probably super absorbing and exciting.
Oh, yeah, totally.
But then, with each reread, it just didn't have that same magic.
Exactly. By like the third or fourth time, I was like, okay, this is not doing it for me anymore.
Right. And that's tolerance in action.
It's a pretty harmless example, though, I guess.
Yeah, it's a good illustration of the concept.
Yeah.
And then neuroadaptation, that's how your brain actually physically changes
Oh, wow.
in response to this chronic exposure to high dopamine rewards.
So it's not just like a feeling, it's actually changing our brain structure.
Yeah, and Dr. Lembke, she uses this really memorable analogy of gremlins.
Gremlins.
Yeah, like little creatures setting up shop on the pain side of that balance scale.
That's a great visual.
Right. So over time, your brain's natural set point for pleasure, it actually shifts downward, and your sensitivity to pain goes up.
So even like small things can start to feel more annoying or bothersome.
Exactly. And the things that used to bring you joy, they might not cut it anymore.
Like my fourth Twilight reread.
That'd
It's
be
like
grand.
the more we chase intense pleasure, the less we can actually enjoy things in the long run.
Yeah. It's kind of a paradox.
It's kind of a cool joke.
It is. And the book talks about this idea of hedonism potentially leading to anhedonia.
Anhedonia.
Yeah, it's the inability to experience pleasure at all.
Wow, that sounds serious.
It is. It can be a really debilitating condition. And Dr. Lembke, she actually shares how even things she used to love, like reading, they eventually lost their appeal for her.
Because of this dopamine overload.
Yeah, because of overexposure to those high dopamine stimuli.
Yeah.
And for people with more severe addictions, it can get to the point where the substance doesn't even give them a high anymore,
Oh, wow.
but they feel absolutely terrible without it. They experience withdrawal symptoms.
Right, and what are some of those withdrawal symptoms?
It can be things like anxiety, irritability, insomnia, and just a general sense of unhappiness or dysphoria.
So it's like their brain is just completely out of whack.
Yeah, it's in a state of intense reaction because that dopamine source has been taken away.
So it's like we're really messing with our brain chemistry when we get into these patterns.
Yeah.
So the book introduces this framework called dopamine to help us understand this better.
Okay.
Can we break that down a bit? What does the P stand for?
P stands for problems.
Problems. Okay.
Yeah, and the idea here is that this constant pursuit of high dopamine experiences, it inevitably leads to negative consequences in our lives.
Okay, so it's not just about the brain chemistry. It's about the real-world problems that can arise.
Exactly. And these problems, they can manifest in all sorts of ways. They can affect our physical health, our relationships, our work or studies, and they can even create ethical or moral dilemmas.
So it's pretty far-reaching.
It is. And Dr. Lembke illustrates this with a story about a cannabis user named Delilah. And Delilah, she didn't really see any major downsides to her daily cannabis use.
Interesting.
She kind of attributed any conflicts to her parents just not approving of it, rather than the drug itself.
So she wasn't connecting the dots between her behavior and the negative consequences.
Right, and I think that's something we all do to some extent. It's hard to be objective when we're caught up in something.
Right. But why is it so hard to see those problems when we're in the midst of these high dopamine activities?
Well, Dr. Lembke explains that these substances and behaviors, they can actually impair our ability to judge cause and effect.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're clouding our judgment.
Exactly. They distort our perception of the negative consequences so we don't see the full picture.
And that immediate pleasure is just so strong.
Right. It overshadows any kind of rational evaluation of what might happen down the road.
So we're kind of blinded by the immediate gratification.
In a way, yes.
So this leads us to the idea of the modern dopamine economy. What is that exactly?
So the dopamine economy, it's basically describing our current environment where there's this unprecedented increase in the availability and potency of things that trigger dopamine release.
Right, so it's not just that there are more things available, it's that they're also stronger.
Exactly. And technology has played a huge role in this.
Right, it's made everything so much more accessible.
Yeah, and it's also expanded the variety and intensity of these experiences.
So there's just so much more to choose from.
Right.
The book uses this interesting historical example of the cigarette rolling machine. How does that tie into this?
So that invention, back in the late 1800s, it dramatically increased the speed and scale of cigarette production,
Okay.
which made them much cheaper and more readily available.
So more people started smoking.
Exactly. And unfortunately, we saw a huge increase in the negative health consequences.
Right.
So it's a clear example of how just making something more available can really fuel widespread use and dependence.
And are we seeing anything similar happening today?
Absolutely. We're seeing it with the rise of polypharmacy, which is the use of multiple drugs at the same time.
Right. And the book talks about a patient named Max whose story really illustrates this.
Yeah, Max's story is pretty alarming. He went from experimenting with alcohol and cannabis to becoming dependent on cocaine, then prescription opioids, and eventually heroin.
All within a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, all within about a decade.
Wow, that's really scary.
It is. It shows how that increased access and potency can lead people down a really dangerous path.
And how does the internet and social media fit into this dopamine economy?
Oh, they've amplified it to a whole new level.
Right. It's like they've taken everything we've talked about and just put it on steroids.
Exactly. They provide unlimited instant access to a huge range of potentially addictive content and behaviors.
So it's not just substances, it's behaviors too.
Right. It's everything from endless scrolling and notifications to online shopping and gaming.
So we're constantly being bombarded with these dopamine hits.
And Dr. Lembke uses this analogy of a flock of birds to describe online social behavior.
Okay, that's interesting.
So when we see tons of people doing something online, it makes it seem normal and acceptable.
Right, so it's like social pressure almost.
Yeah, and it can make us more likely to participate even if those behaviors are harmful or addictive.
And that can lead to new addictive behaviors that we might never have even thought about before.
Right, and the book talks about a guy named Jacob whose online pornography addiction escalated to the point where he was involved in live chat rooms.
Oh, wow.
And that had a huge negative impact on his marriage.
So it's like the internet can create this environment where these behaviors can really spiral out of control.
Yeah, it's so easy to get sucked in, and the anonymity and constant novelty, they just fuel the addiction.
So given this overwhelming environment full of dopamine triggers, what are some solutions that Dopamine Nation proposes?
So one of the key ideas is self-binding.
Self-binding?
Yeah, it's basically about intentionally creating barriers between yourself and the substance or behavior that's causing you problems.
Okay, so it's like recognizing that willpower alone isn't enough.
Right, you need to actually put obstacles in your own way.
Interesting.
Like the book talks about Jacob throwing away his masturbation machine.
Okay, so that's like a physical barrier.
Exactly. It's about removing the immediate source of temptation.
And are there other types of self-binding?
Yeah, there's temporal self-binding, which is about setting time limits.
Like saying, I'm only going to allow myself to do this on weekends.
Exactly. But as the book points out, that can be really hard to stick to.
Right.
There's also categorical self-binding, which is about limiting entire categories of things,
Like what?
like going vegetarian or gluten-free.
Oh, okay. So it's about reducing the overall number of triggers.
Exactly. But the book also makes the point that this can be undermined by market forces, like the explosion of gluten-free products.
Right, because now there are just as many tempting options even within that restricted category. And then there's this really interesting idea of deifying the demonized.
Yeah, that's a fascinating one.
What is that?
It's about taking something that's usually seen as negative and elevating it to a sacred context.
Okay.
So like certain drugs might only be used in religious ceremonies or spiritual practices.
And that limits their use.
Exactly, because there are strict rules and rituals around it.
Wow, that's a really different approach.
It is. But it shows how different cultures have found ways to manage these powerful substances.
And it's really about creating that context and those boundaries.
Right. And in Jacob's case, he eventually found more success by not only getting rid of the machine, but also by limiting his access to technology in general.
So it was about creating multiple layers of barriers.
Yeah, and I think that's a key takeaway. It's about being proactive and intentional about creating those obstacles.
So it's not just about willpower, it's about setting yourself up for success.
Exactly.
Another big theme in Dopamine Nation is the role of honesty.
Yes.
Why is that so important for finding balance and recovering from these patterns?
So Dr. Lembke argues that radical honesty, being truthful about our experiences, our struggles, even the small things, it's essential for breaking free from these cycles.
Why is that?
Well, she shares the story of Maria, who would hide even tiny details about her drinking.
Oh, wow.
And it was like, those little lies were actually reinforcing the bigger pattern of deception.
So it's like the act of lying itself becomes part of the problem.
Exactly. And radical honesty, it disrupts that cycle. It forces us to confront the reality of our actions.
And it allows us to connect with other people more authentically.
Right, because we're being vulnerable and open, and it helps us build a more truthful story about our own lives.
Which I guess leads to greater self-accountability.
Exactly. We're not hiding from ourselves anymore.
That's powerful. And there's some research suggesting that honesty can actually strengthen the prefrontal cortex.
Right, which is the part of our brain that's involved in planning, decision-making, and self-control.
So it's like honesty can actually make us better at regulating our impulses.
That's what the research suggests. And, you talked about recognizing your own maybe unconventional romance novel habit
Oh, yeah.
and getting rid of your e-reader.
It was tough, but
But that act of honesty was really the first step towards changing that pattern.
it was. It was like I had to admit to myself how much it was affecting me.
And then you took action based on that honesty.
Right. It was like a self-binding act rooted in that honesty.
Exactly.
So let's talk about shame. The book makes this important distinction between destructive shame and pro-social shame. What's the difference?
So destructive shame, it's that feeling of deep self-loathing and worthlessness.
Okay.
It often involves judgment and rejection from others.
So you're already feeling bad about yourself, and then other people make you feel even worse.
Exactly. And that can actually make the problem worse because it drives the behavior underground.
You're more likely to hide it and not seek help.
Exactly. But pro-social shame is different.
Okay.
It involves feelings of remorse, but within a context of acceptance and empathy.
So you're acknowledging that you did something wrong, but you're not being condemned for it.
Right. It's about holding yourself accountable without attacking your own worth.
And that can actually be motivating, right?
Yeah, because it makes you want to make amends and change your behavior.
The book talks about a patient who found Alcoholics Anonymous to be a de-shaming process.
Yeah, it's a great example of how the right environment can make all the difference.
So how does AA foster that kind of supportive atmosphere?
Well, in AA, people can share their struggles openly without judgment.
Right.
There's this shared experience and understanding that creates a really powerful sense of solidarity.
And it's not just about the support, it's about belonging to a group.
Right, it's a club good, where the benefits are amplified by that shared journey and the absence of destructive shame.
So it's like everyone's in it together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that allows people to start forgiving themselves and focus on moving forward.
That's really powerful. Now, it's also important to consider how the book has been received and if there's been any criticism. Our listener review pointed out a few areas where the book might have some limitations. What were those?
So one point was that the narrative style could sometimes feel a bit disjointed.
Okay.
Like it was hard to follow the thread of a particular argument or remember which patient's story connected to which concept.
Right, and when you're weaving together complex scientific explanations with lots of personal stories, it's easy to get lost.
Definitely. And the reviewer also mentioned the lack of chapter summaries.
Yeah, that would have been helpful.
Yeah, it would have made it easier to recap the key takeaways.
Another point of feedback was about the level of detail in some of the addiction stories.
Right. The reviewer felt that some of the descriptions were pretty graphic and potentially triggering for some readers.
Yeah, especially for people who have personal experience with addiction or trauma.
Exactly. It's a sensitive topic, and there's a fine line between being illustrative and being overwhelming.
Definitely. And the last point was about the focus on more severe forms of addiction. The reviewer felt that the book didn't really address those lower-level compulsions that many people struggle with.
Like social media overuse or online shopping.
Right, and those are so prevalent in our daily lives.
They are.
Yeah.
And it would have been interesting to see those explored in more depth.
So while the book's message is really powerful, it sounds like the presentation and the scope might not resonate with everyone.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
But overall, it's been a really insightful deep dive into Dopamine Nation.
It has.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the pleasure-pain balance to tolerance and neuroadaptation to the importance of self-binding and radical honesty.
And the idea of the modern dopamine economy.
Right. It's clear that finding balance in this world is more challenging than ever.
It is.
So for our listeners, we'll leave you with this thought.
Okay.
Is there an area in your own life where chasing pleasure might actually be creating some underlying pain or dissatisfaction?
It's a good question to ask ourselves.
What small act of self-binding or radical honesty could you try to shift that balance back towards equilibrium? It's about being mindful and making conscious choices.
Dr. Lemke's book gives us a really valuable framework for understanding our relationship with pleasure and pain. And hopefully this deep dive has given you some food for thought and some encouragement to explore these concepts further.
Absolutely. And to think about how they apply to your own life.
Exactly. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Dopamine Nation.
It's been a pleasure.
It has.